Not stopped, changed. Each inhale came slower than the last, pulled through something thick and wet. His chest rose like a drowning man breaking the surface one final time. Padre Pio stood at the foot of the bed, rosary frozen in his hand. The room was small, a single oil lamp, stone walls that held the cold. The man's wife knelt beside the mattress, her lips moving in prayer, her hand gripping fingers that no longer gripped back. But Pio wasn't looking at the dying man, he was looking at what stood behind him. 3 shapes. Tall, bent forward like men waiting for a door to open. They had no faces Pio could describe, only the suggestion of watching, of patience that had no kindness in it. They stood in the corner where the lamplight didn't reach, and they did not move. The man coughed, blood flecked his lips. His wife whispered, "Father, please, the sacrament." Pio's voice came out steady. "Has he confessed?" She looked up, confused. He cannot speak, Father. His throat. Before, when did he last confess?" Her face went pale. "Years. He said the church took his son. He said he would never." The shapes leaned closer, not toward the bed, toward the space above it. Pio saw it then, a faint shimmer, like heat rising from summer stone. It hovered just above the man's chest, tethered by something Pio couldn't name. The soul, still bound, still inside, but pulling free with every broken breath. And the 3 figures were waiting for the moment it separated. "Get me water," Pio said. The wife stood, trembling. "Father, he cannot drink." "Now." She ran. Pio stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. The shapes did not retreat. They simply watched, patient as fishermen over a net. He could feel their presence now, not cold, but absent of warmth. A void that pulled at the edges of the lamplight. He knelt beside the bed and leaned close to the man's ear. The smell of death was already there, sweet and rotten, mixing with the medicinal herbs scattered on the nightstand. "I know you can hear me." The man's eyelids fluttered. "Barely. You have seconds. Not minutes. You know what waits for you." A sound escaped the man's throat, not a word. A rasp. Defiant, even now. Pio glanced at the corner. One of the shapes had moved closer. Not walking, simply existing now in a space it hadn't occupied a moment before. The air around it seemed darker, thicker. "Your son," Pio whispered, leaning closer still, "is not lost. But you will be." The man's eyes opened. They were bloodshot, yellowed, wet with the glaze of death. But they focused. They saw. Pio felt the pressure in the room shift. The shapes straightened, and for the first time, Pio sensed something like anticipation in them. Not eagerness. Something colder. The certainty of a harvest. "If you want mercy," Pio said, his voice dropping to barely a breath, "you don't have time for pride." The man's lips moved. No sound came out. His hand, thin, skeletal, the skin like parchment stretched over bone, lifted an inch off the bed. The fingers trembled, then fell. His breathing stopped. The wife returned with the water, saw her husband's stillness, and let out a cry that filled the small room like a wound opening. The cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the stone floor, water spreading in dark fingers across the gaps between tiles. But Pio did not move, because the shimmer above the man's chest had not faded. It hung there, suspended. The soul, separated now, but not yet gone. Pio could see it more clearly in this moment than he'd seen it while the man lived. It held a shape almost human, but lighter, as though carved from fog and starlight. And it was trembling. The 3 shapes took a step forward. All of them, in unison. Pio stood. He raised his right hand, still bearing the hidden wound beneath the fingerless glove, and he felt the familiar burning, sharp, deep, divine. He spoke, not in Italian, but in Latin, the words of the Church's oldest binding prayer. His voice filled the small room, pushing against the encroaching darkness. The shapes stopped. They did not retreat, but they stopped. The wife stared at him through her tears, her sobs choking off into silence. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the weight of them. The lamp flame bent sideways, though no wind blew. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that her breath misted in the air. The shimmer wavered, pulled in 2 directions. Pio saw threads, invisible except in the way light bent around them, reaching from the soul toward the darkness in the corner. And reaching, faintly, barely visible, toward the crucifix on the wall. Pio's voice rose. Not loud, but absolute. Each syllable a declaration, a boundary drawn in the invisible world that overlapped this one. The shapes tilted their heads. Not in confusion, in recognition, in the acknowledgement of authority they could not cross. One of them extended what might have been a hand, a limb of pure shadow, fingers too long, too thin. It reached toward the soul, but stopped inches away, as though pressing against glass. And then, slowly, so slowly Pio thought it might not happen at all, the threads reaching toward the corner began to fray. One by one, they snapped. The shimmer shuddered, turned, rose, gently, like smoke drawn upward by warmth, like a child finally choosing to come home. It passed through the ceiling, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted all at once. The temperature rose. The lamp flame straightened. The wife gasped as though she'd been holding her breath underwater. The three figures were gone. Pio stayed at the bedside while the wife wept. Her hand still gripped her husband's, though the fingers beneath hers were already cooling. He did not interrupt her grief. The room felt larger now, empty in a way it hadn't been before. Outside, the first birds began to call. Dawn was still an hour away, but the darkness had begun to thin at the edges of the window. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swollen. "Father, what happened here? Your husband is at peace now. But I saw you were speaking, and the room." She stopped, searching for words. It felt like something was fighting. "It's finished." She studied his face. Did he, at the end, he made his choice. That seemed to be enough. She nodded, though the questions remained in her eyes. Pio didn't offer more. Some things lived better in silence. He stood slowly. His knees ached from kneeling on the hard floor. The wounds in his hands pulsed with each heartbeat, a reminder he'd long stopped questioning. "I'll send the women from the village," he said, "to help prepare him." "Thank you, Father." He left the house as the sky turned from black to gray. The air outside was cold and clean, and he breathed deeply, clearing his lungs of the scent of death and herbs. But the memory stayed with him, the way the soul had hesitated, the pull toward the corner, not dragged, choosing. He walked back to the monastery slowly, his sandals scraping against the dirt road. 3 days later, a farmer stopped Pio in the monastery courtyard. The man carried a basket of bread and a clay jug of oil, offerings for the community. But his hands trembled as he set them down. "Father, I need to speak with you." Pio gestured to a stone bench beneath an olive tree. They sat. "I knew the man who died," the farmer said. "The one you visited 3 nights ago." Pio waited. "His name was Giuseppe. We grew up together, worked the same fields as boys." The farmer's voice was tight. "His son drowned 15 years ago. Spring floods. The river came up fast that year. I heard something of this." The farmer nodded. "The boy was only 7. They found him 2 miles downstream, caught in the roots of a fallen oak." Pio said nothing. Giuseppe blamed God for it. The farmer's hands twisted together. He burned his prayer book in the town square. When the priest came to comfort him, Giuseppe spat at his feet, told him to leave. Men grieve in different ways. "It wasn't grief, Father. It was guilt." Pio turned to look at him. The farmer met his eyes. Giuseppe was supposed to watch the children that night. He'd promised his wife, but he went to the tavern instead. "We were all there, celebrating a harvest, drinking too much. The children were alone. The courtyard was silent except for the wind moving through the olive branches. When they brought the boy's body back, blue and swollen, Giuseppe looked at his wife and said, 'God should have been watching.'" The farmer's voice broke. "But we all knew." He couldn't say what he really meant, which was, "I should have been watching." Pio let the silence settle between them. He never forgave himself, the farmer continued. "So he made it about God instead. Easier to be angry than ashamed." "Why are you telling me this now?" The farmer looked down at his hands. "Because I was there. At the tavern. I was the one who kept filling his cup. I could have told him to go home. I could have walked him back myself. But you didn't." "No." Pio placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but the farmer's eyes filled with tears. "You carry this now," Pio said. "Every day. Then you understand what Giuseppe carried." The farmer nodded slowly. "You're here," Pio said. "Asking, confessing. He spent 15 years running from the same question." "Is that why?" The farmer stopped. "When you were in that room, did you see something?" Pio was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw a man at the edge of a choice." "Did he make the right one?" "He made the only one he had left." The farmer stood. He picked up his empty basket, nodded once, and walked away. Pio sat alone beneath the olive tree. The sun climbed higher, warming the stones of the courtyard. He thought about Giuseppe, about the soul hovering above the body, trembling between 2 directions, about how close it had come to turning the wrong way. Guilt was a strange prison. The bars were invisible, but they held just as tight. That night, Pio did not sleep. He knelt in his cell, rosary in hand, and prayed until the darkness outside turned to gray. The wounds in his hands bled through the bandages, soaking into the worn wood of the floor. He didn't stop. He prayed for Giuseppe, For the boy who drowned. For the wife, alone now in an empty house. For the farmer who remembered. And for himself, because he knew he would see this again. Another room. Another soul. Another hesitation. The prayers became a rhythm. The words blurred together. His knees bled through his habit, but the pain kept him present. Dawn came slowly. Light crept across the cell floor, inch by inch. He was still praying. 2 weeks later, another call came. A woman in the next village. Old, her family said. Dying peacefully. Pio walked the 3 miles in the afternoon heat. By the time he arrived, the sun was low and the shadows long. The house was larger than Giuseppe's. Clean, well kept. Inside, the woman's children and grandchildren surrounded her bed, their voices soft. Pio entered the room and stopped just inside the doorway. The shimmer was already there, hovering above the woman's chest. But this time, the corner held no shadows, no shapes, no waiting presence. Instead, the room felt warm. Light gathered near the ceiling, gentle and patient. The woman's breathing was soft and steady. Her lips moved in prayer, though no sound came out. Her eyes were closed, but her face was peaceful. Pio approached the bed slowly. The family made space for him. He placed his hand on hers. Her skin was thin as paper, cool but not cold. She opened her eyes, looked directly at him, and smiled. "Father," she whispered, "I'm here. It's beautiful. What do you see? What's waiting for me?" Her children leaned closer, tears on their faces. "Don't be afraid," she said to them. "I'm not." Her breathing slowed, each breath softer than the last, then stopped. The shimmer rose without hesitation, smoothly, like it had been expected all along. It passed through the ceiling, and the room filled with something Pio had no words for. Not silence, but peace so complete it felt like a presence. The family wept, but their grief was different. Clean, unburdened. Pio stood beside the bed long after they had left to make arrangements. He stared at the empty air where the soul had been. 2 deaths, 2 souls, 2 directions. Giuseppe had carried 15 years of blame and refusal. This woman had carried a lifetime of prayer and surrender. The weight wasn't the difference. What mattered was what they'd done with it. One had let it become a wall between himself and grace. The other had offered it up, piece by piece, year after year. Mercy had been available to both. Only one had known how to receive it. Months passed. Winter came to the monastery. One evening, a young friar found Pio in the cloister, walking slowly through the covered archways. "Father, may I walk with you?" Of course. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Finally, the young man said, "Father, what do you fear most?" Pio didn't answer right away. They completed another circuit of the cloister before he spoke. That a man might stand at the edge of eternity and choose to fall. The friar frowned. But surely no one would choose damnation. Pio stopped walking. He turned to face the younger man. "They don't call it damnation," he said quietly. "They call it justice. What they deserve. The honest end to a wasted life. But that's not, I know. But mercy requires something not everyone has." "What?" "The willingness to be forgiven." The young friar looked troubled. "I don't understand." Pio resumed walking. "Some men carry guilt so long, it becomes who they are. Letting it go would mean admitting they could have let it go years earlier. That all that suffering was a choice. That seems impossible. It happens more than you think." They walked another circuit in silence. "Father," the young man said carefully, "have you seen this? Someone who refused mercy." Pio didn't answer directly. "I've seen souls at the moment of separation. Some turn toward light immediately. Others hesitate. And the ones who hesitate, some still turn. At the last second." Pio paused. "Some almost don't." The young friar absorbed this. "What makes the difference?" "Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that says, 'I don't deserve forgiveness, so I won't ask for it.' That doesn't sound like pride. It's the worst kind. It puts their judgment above God's mercy." The young man fell silent, uneasy. Pio placed a hand on his shoulder. "When your moment comes, and it will come, remember this. Despair that refuses hope is still pride, just wearing different clothes." He walked on, leaving the friar alone with a truth that would take years to fully understand. In his final years, Pio rarely spoke of what he'd witnessed in those rooms. But the priests who lived closest to him noticed certain things. When he prayed the rosary each night, he would slow at the sorrowful mysteries. The agony in the garden, the scourging, the crowning with thorns. His lips would move, barely audible. Once, a priest asked what he prayed for during those moments. Pio's answer was always the same: for those who stand at the edge. That they recognize what's offered before the choice is made. Because in that room with Giuseppe, Pio had learned something that stayed with him until his death. The battle for a soul wasn't won in the moment of death, it was won in the moment before, when breath still remained, when the threads could still break, when mercy stood waiting, patient, quiet, and closer than the darkness. He'd seen the soul that turned toward light in the final second, pulled free by prayer and grace. And he'd seen the soul that had almost turned the other way, drawn by 15 years of guilt wrapped around itself like chains. Both had been free to choose. Both had been offered the same mercy, but only one had the humility to accept what was given. That was the difference between heaven and hell, Pio came to believe. Not the magnitude of what you'd done, but whether you could let it be forgiven, whether you could release what you'd been carrying, whether you could accept that mercy didn't need to be earned, only received. Giuseppe had reached for it at the last possible moment. Others, Pio knew, would not. And that knowledge kept him on his knees, praying through the night, bleeding through his bandages, offering up his pain for souls he would never meet. For souls standing at the edge right now, in rooms just like that one, choosing.